Kyle, I want to just start by, I suppose, just assessing where we are at now in the kind of disinformation campaign, and I suppose contrast that to where it began. How's it evolved?
It's evolved pretty significantly. I mean, you could go back to pre the war, honestly, if you wanted to look at the months at the end of 2021 leading into the invasion in February 2022. The arguments around whether this is something countering Nazism, for example, or as it's sometimes represented as countering Satanism, countering NATO expansion, they've focused on quite a few different talking points. And that has been impacted at times by social media regulation, for example. Deplatforming people on Twitter has forced a lot of individuals to focus primarily on Telegram or state TV. But they've also been kind of getting active feedback from the public as well, right? So they've been testing some narratives out, seeing whether or not people resonate with them and whether or not it can help build public support. So at the moment, it seems from everything that I've been tracking that they have now kind of framed this as a counterterrorism operation. Again, if you look back at history with Russia, you have the Second Chechen War. Putin comes into power. He frames the new war in Chechnya as trying to combat terrorism. And they're doing something similar when it comes to Ukraine right now. They're framing some of these things like the attack on the Black Sea Fleet that happened, I think, last week, or the claims of a dirty bomb possibly being used at Chernobyl. All of these things are framing the Ukrainian state as being a terrorist state now, which is kind of the existential threat that they're now framing.
You mentioned there are things like Telegram. Is that how you're able to track this disinformation spread? Is it through apps like that, or are you also tracking kind of state TV? What are you kind of assessing?
Yeah, so I look at content from really a variety of places. I think Telegram is a big one right now. They recently put some restrictions in place in Russia, specifically for Telegram. State TV is another big one, right? You look at some of these television presenters, some of the bigger influencers in Russian society, the things that they're talking about. But you also have very interesting figures like Ramzan Kadyrov, for example, who's the president of Chechnya, who has a massive following now. He's always been pretty popular on Instagram, but he's become a really, really big and influential voice kind of in the Russian information space as the war has progressed. So I try to make it pretty holistic. I try to kind of take in things from every possible content source rather than just one specific thing.
Is it ever possible to assess, I suppose, the impact of disinformation like this? So if it's about portraying Ukraine, as you've highlighted, as some sort of terrorist actor in these sorts of circumstances, who is that information for? Is it for the Russian population at large?
Partially, yes. I think there's always multiple strategic goals when it comes to Russian disinformation, what they're putting out into the ecosystem, what they're trying to accomplish. Specifically when we're speaking about the counterterrorism operation angle that's been pushed recently, I think, yes, it's partially to kind of play to the domestic audience who had issues with the way mobilization was enacted, for example. There were a lot of reports that were submitted to even people like the editor-in-chief of RT, for example, that mobilization was happening in possibly illegal ways. So they've had to win some public support back in terms of how they're framing this campaign. But another thing that's important to note is they look at the international community and they try to find things that maybe people elsewhere can also resonate with. So it's something that they've struggled with, I would say, throughout the conflict, is whether or not they even want to frame this as something that is admirable or necessary to the international community. But then also, are there people outside of Russia that can resonate with any of the things that they're saying kind of publicly?
That's really interesting. So trying to get that disinformation into sort of an international audience. And I suppose with that in mind, the kind of reverse of that, the work that you're doing to highlight what is disinformation, is there any way to understand if that pushes back against the disinformation within Russia, if you see what I mean? Is there any way that the truth is able to kind of go up against these disinformation propaganda campaigns?
You have a very interesting situation when you're looking at that, right? Because Russia has effectively been cut off from a lot of the information ecosystems because of domestic policies, right? They've banned the use of a lot of applications that are social media platforms. People are somewhat limited in terms of where they can receive information from. So anything that would necessarily be combating those disinformation talking points very often doesn't actually get through to the Russian people. So I would say there's not a whole lot of work being done to kind of combat it. There are definitely people who are attempting to, engage in their own information campaign, let's say, to highlight these things to the Russian population, but it's not something that I've seen significant traction with. in terms of swaying the public opinion.
That's interesting too, because my next thought was about to what extent does disinformation, I suppose, from Russia's point of view, aid their military effort, and I suppose beyond that, aid Putin in some way. Is there a tangible outcome and effect of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. You look at some of the influencers in disinformation. I think about some television presenters, for example, who were calling for critical infrastructure strikes on Ukraine for a month, 2 months prior to when they actually were enacted. So you almost have a cyclical relationship between both of them. The disinformation campaigns coming from state TV and on places like Telegram are somewhat supporting the war, but they're also trying to push their own agenda about what they would like to see be done in Ukraine.
my my final thought is around how this ends, and I suppose that's everyone's thought at this point when it comes to the war. But something I realized is that even if the war concludes, disinformation about the war will probably not conclude.
That I've been particularly interested in recently is understanding what foreign influence looks like from Russia after this war is over. We obviously know what role it's played in the past in things like US elections. We know that Russian information campaigns have been pretty prevalent worldwide. They're not necessarily a new thing, they're just hyper focused right now on the situation in Ukraine. So, what it looks like after the war is something that's yet to be defined. It's something that I ask myself every day. What level of influence will they have? And will they be kind of a side actor that's just, again, pushing on these polarizing points from the outside in? Because they do have a good context and understanding of what domestic issues in places like the UK and the US really do create division and polarization. So I think it's possible that they continue doing these things on the side, even if the war ends and they don't have as much influence as they've had in the past.